are back, and we are joined now by Michel, director of the Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation, author of the upcoming book, Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. His piece in the New Republic is titled, How Viktor Orbán Conquered the Heritage Foundation. Casey, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Emma, thanks so much for having me.
So, let's start here. Who is Viktor Orbán, and what does he mean to the global right-wing project right now?
Yeah, his day job, Viktor Orbán, is the 14-year long-serving prime minister in the country of Hungary, but he is so much more than a Hungarian politician right now. He has become, over the past few years, this kind of icon, certainly in the West as well as globally, for those that like to rail against so-called wokeness, progressive policies, gender identity, sexual relations, so on and so forth. He has become kind of a lodestar and, again, an icon for what a leader, an elected leader, can do to demolish a democracy, as we have seen take place in Hungary over the past few years. And he has certainly created a model that those in the United States of America that are supporting Donald Trump would love to see play out right here in the U.S.
So would it be fair to describe him as a Christian theocrat to a degree?
There are certainly elements of that. It is not, there's not significant indication that Orbán himself is any kind of overwhelming or overweening believer. He has not had any kind of fundamentalist background himself. In that sense, he's kind of similar to Donald Trump as someone who didn't arise out of the kind of evangelical far-right theocratic mix, but he has certainly turned to them as his base of support and leaned on them in terms of supporting his anti-democratic and authoritarian policies, all of which have been for their benefit.
What are the notions, I should say, of like moral traditionalism, right? That he seems to kind of promulgate as the leader of Hungary.
Yes, he pushes a lot of the same rhetoric we see certainly in the United States among those on the religious right, those evangelical supporters of Donald Trump, and certainly Donald Trump himself. These ideas of tradition and traditionalism, these ideas of returning to some kind of nuclear family, these ideas of using the state to propound policies, to actually implement policies that will encourage, again, this notion of kind of a man and a wife and a handful of children, you know, this kind of idealized version, certainly in the United States, that we saw in the 1950s, that has led to all manner of policies rolling back, again, the kind of progressive rights, progressive gains we have seen over the past few years. Again, rhetorically, it's about returning to some kind of long lost, you know, nostalgic kind of gauzy history in which Hungary was once a great country, and certainly the United States was once a so-called great country. If anything, Orbán's slogan is very much make Hungary great again. And certainly that's what we've seen with Donald Trump.
It is kind of a hallmark of fascists and far-right people and far-right ideology to harken back to an imagined past. I know that Orbán also is kind of a bit of a Putin fan as well. Vladimir Putin invokes this in order to justify his imperial ambitions in Ukraine. Can you speak a bit about their relationship?
Yes, absolutely. They have, by all appearances, a very close relationship, certainly closer than anything Putin has with any other leading figure in the European Union or in NATO. Again, Hungary being an EU member as well as a NATO ally of the U.S. Everything I just said about these ideas of traditionalism, these ideas of traditional masculinity, these ideas of returning a country, a state, a nation to a formerly great status once more is everything we have seen out of Moscow under Putin over the last quarter century. And it's also a reason that Putin has attracted so much support among the religious right in Europe, but especially in the United States of America as well. It is a similar, if not identical, model. Orbán is not yet the dictator that we have seen take place in Moscow under Putin. He has not yet created that dictatorship. He's certainly on that trajectory. However, and again, this is all a model that Donald Trump and his base would love to see take root in the United States of America.
Yeah, I want to get to the connections to Trump and the Heritage Foundation, which is, you know, the thrust of your piece here. But to give people an even more robust sense of this ideology is really key, because you hear things about. So he's a pro-natalist politician, right? I'm wondering if you could expand on that. Elon Musk is speaking in these terms these days. Tucker Carlson is speaking in these terms these days. This just fixation on birth rates, a very specific kind of person who needs to be giving birth, very much heteronormative, and also focused on racial purity. This is central to Orbán's politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you make a great point. It is not about population growth. It is certainly not about welcoming immigrant populations into whether it's Hungary or Russia or obviously the United States of America. I think Orbán first crossed a lot of folks' radars outside of Hungary back in the mid-2010s when there was this immigration and refugee surge coming from especially the Middle East. And Orbán took the lead, both rhetorically as well as in terms of policy, and making sure that as few as possible of those families, those children that were in need, looking for food, looking for shelter, did not find it in Hungary. Now we see that clamp down on any kind of immigration, again, encouraging the kind of nativist, racialist approach that we've seen take place under Orbán, and certainly Trump has amplified in the United States. We have seen that as well as some of these policies you mentioned a moment ago, these nominally pro-natalist policies to encourage, again, heteronormative family structures. And frankly, at the end of the day, trying to get Hungarian women to have as many children as possible. Again, they paper it over with this rhetoric about returning the nation to greatness and simply supporting local economics. But at the end of the day, it is nothing if not pure nativism, pure racism through and through.
And he's very much in keeping with the Georgia Maloney's of Europe as well, right? And their just desire to see migrants drown in the sea.
Yeah, absolutely. You made a point a moment ago, Emma, that it harkens back. It certainly gestures at some of the traditional fascist approaches we have seen in Europe as well as elsewhere. There was a great book that came out a few months ago called America Last by an American writer named Jacob Heilbrunn, looking at traditional American support for fascist dictators abroad. And one of those being especially Benito Mussolini, the kind of fascist, the very first one, who implemented many of these same policies and used much of the same exact rhetoric in terms of the creation of Italian families, the defense of traditional masculinity, as well as, in Mussolini's head, the defense of white Christianity in and of itself. Again, we are seeing this take root in Orbán, in Hungary, and elsewhere.
So I guess then it's a good opportunity then to turn to where they want to take root, this ideology wants to take root now, which is in the United States, specifically through the Heritage Foundation. You write about this in the New Republic. I'd encourage everybody to read that piece, how Orbán came to the United States a few weeks ago, and he did not meet with Biden through traditional diplomatic channels, as would be appropriate for this kind of visit. He just went and met with Trump. Talk a bit about what happened there.
Yeah, this is, again, a head of state for a member of the European Union. This is a NATO ally. Other EU heads of states, other NATO allies, and those heads come to the United States of America all the time. And almost always, without fail, they go to Washington, they go to the White House, and they have a sit down with President Biden or whoever is in the White House at this time. This trip was different in a way that, frankly, I have never seen before. First, Orbán went to not Washington, but down to Florida, down to Mar-a-Lago, to have a sit down with former President Trump. According to some of the footage that came out afterward, they were not only sitting down and talking about some of these common policies and certainly Trump's fandom of Orbán, but apparently they attended a concert of a Beatles cover band as well. I'm not sure if that cover band knew exactly who was in the audience that day, but we'll leave that to the side. But then Orbán did go to Washington. Again, a very traditional route, these foreign heads of states going to Washington. But he did not go to the White House. Apparently, he didn't meet with a single member of the American diplomatic staff. Instead, he spoke at a closed-door meeting. The photos made it seem like there were a few hundred individuals who were there. A closed-door meeting of the Heritage Foundation, which is, again, one of the leading, if not the leading, pro-Trump think tanks in Washington, and has really taken a lead in crafting the kinds of Trumpist policies they would love to see a Trump 2.0 implement should he win in November.
The only example that I can think of that is fairly recent that is analogous is when Netanyahu under Obama circumvented traditional diplomatic channels and just went and worked with the Republicans in Congress to speak to them. But that was obviously a very public thing, you know, and in the within the capacity of like Congress and outside of just it being through shady Heritage Foundation kind of more submerged power structures.
Yeah, God knows I'll be the last person on earth to defend Benjamin Netanyahu, but at the very least, when he was in Washington all those years ago, he was meeting with other congressional officials, other representative members of the U.S. Congress, Orbán was not. He was simply going to Washington solely to have a sit-down conversation with the president of the Heritage Foundation, again, in front of a couple hundred members, not only of the Heritage Foundation, but according to the readout that they had, other conservative writers, other conservative activists, and other conservative policymakers. We still don't have a roster of all the individuals who were there. I would love to get my hands on that at some point, but it has been an incredibly non-transparent event and meeting. Again, we only have these kind of trickles that have come out since the Heritage Foundation did not publicly advertise it. They do not have anything on their website at last check about it. It was all very hush-hush, and we still had plenty of questions about what they actually talked about.
So, yeah, I guess, can you give, you write about how Vivek Ramaswamy was in attendance, the Heritage President Kevin Roberts was there. What do you know about this meeting?
Well, again, unfortunately, very little. We have one readout from the Hungarian side that says Orbán talked about, again, many of the things that are just kind of in his wheelhouse: anti-wokeness, family policies, traditionalism, so on and so forth, that we have already discussed earlier. Again, yes, Vivek Ramaswamy apparently is still doing the circuit. I'm not sure if he's formally affiliated with Heritage or he was just in town. But again, there's a little bit of sure, it's just a matter of time. It's almost less interesting to me in terms of what the content of the actual talk was. And again, he was having to sit down with Kevin Roberts, who was appointed in 2021 as the head of the Heritage Foundation, and has taken that organization in a clearly pro-Trump, pro-Orbán direction. He is, among plenty of other things, an election denier, says he didn't believe Joe Biden freely and fairly won the 2020 election. It's almost less interesting to me what they talked about, so much for what this says about not only where Hungary fits in with things like American foreign policy and where Orbán fits in with the broader kind of global right, but also how it is that the Heritage Foundation has become this go-to plank for figures like this, and then even pulling back the lack of information, the clear lack of transparency about American think tanks writ large. I mean, I've been writing on the lack of clarity, the lack of transparency for funding for American think tanks for almost 10 years at this point. I've certainly never seen anything like the Hungarian, the Orbán sit down at Heritage, but American think tanks for years have been opening their doors to dictatorial wealth, dictatorial donations, and funds from other authoritarian regimes. In that sense, it was simply keeping with the tradition we've seen elsewhere, but this was certainly something new, certainly something that was innovative in this space.
But the Heritage Foundation ties are not new. Can you speak a bit about the Denu Institute and its connections to the Heritage Foundation? What it is within the context of Hungarian politics, and how it has such close ties to the Heritage Foundation?
Sure, absolutely. Again, I think pulling back, we need to remember that Viktor Orbán has demolished any semblance of democracy in Hungary itself, step by step dismantling all the kind of democratic credentials in Hungary. And part of that is using state funds and state resources to direct them toward new organizations that are nominally independent, not necessarily or technically part of the government, but are still used as simply propaganda arms that are used to propagate pro-Orbán rhetoric while still having the kind of veneer of independence behind them. And that is exactly what the Denu Institute is. It was formed a while back and then began receiving in recent years state funding directly or through a foundation that is solely funded by the Hungarian state. It is now little more than an arm of the Orbán government and of pro-Orbán propaganda itself. And not long ago, it inked a formal partnership with an American organization called the Heritage Foundation. They are now formal partners. They have, according to the Heritage spokesperson, a memorandum of understanding for joint research, joint events, joint conferences, some of which we have already seen. Certainly, the meeting in Washington seems to be an outgrowth of that meeting. But again, we have an American think tank that has gone all in on Trump, setting up a formal partnership with an organization that is purely state-funded and that is little more than a cutout for the Orbán regime. Again, we have these formal linkages where they can amplify one another's messages, reach similar audiences in the U.S. and in Hungary, as well as elsewhere.
Where's Steve Bannon in all this? Because this seems very Bannon-y to me.
It's a wonderful question. I should say that Steve Bannon, I'm not aware of him being in attendance at the Heritage Foundation event. I did not see any familiar faces or that, olive green, frumpy, lumpy coat that he likes to wear in the audience today. But we do know that Orbán also met with Steve Bannon when he was in the United States of America. Again, we don't have any details. We just have a kind of a half-second clip that Orbán later posted to Instagram. We know there's a relationship there. And again, as you said, Emma, this absolutely reeks of something that Bannon would love to do. Again, these kind of false front organizations that are little more than cutouts, these kinds of backroom, back channel conversations, all of which allow figures like Orbán to directly target American conservatives, American reactionaries, the Trump base, so on and so forth, as well as all of those potential future policymakers under a Trump administration, under a Trump 2.0. Absolutely. This has the shadow of Steve Bannon hanging all over it.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like these are his politics, and they're winning. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what this connection represents within the context of the you wrote about it in your piece, but the very Reaganite Heritage Foundation now just kind of moving towards this global consolidation of fascist ideals, one that's fixated on kind of borders, preservation of traditional family or certain kinds of skin color, and even using the government to perpetuate that. You alluded to it earlier, but Orbán, some of his policies are about giving massive tax breaks to women who have multiple children and stay home, and you hear some of that in these new right figures, and this seems to me to be a more formal diversion from Reaganite politics towards this exact kind of vision, which Trump also represents.
Yeah, I don't even know if I would describe it as more formal. That's maybe underselling it at this point. As far as I'm concerned, this is a clear break with what the Heritage Foundation once was, and again, came to prominence in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. Very much a transatlantic, very much national security first, certainly very pro-NATO as well, and certainly at the time anti-Soviet, and even certainly before the recent shift, anti-Putin. That has all gone out the window. They are all in on anti-democratic authoritarian policies. They are all in on being, for lack of a better term, the brain trust of a Trump 2.0 administration. I think I used in the article the term intellectual, and I had actually one of my contacts who's on the conservative side. He's not a Trump supporter, but he reached out and said, you can't use the word intellectual about these people whatsoever. This is pure anti-intellectual rot through and through. And if nothing else, this is what Orbán represents. This is the model that the Steve Bannons of the world and the Donald Trumps as well and his base of the world would like to see implemented in the United States of America. It is a dismantling of democratic credentials. It is an undermining and undercutting of American democracy writ large. And again, going back to the Reagan precedent, it is a doing away with this notion that government needs to be small, government needs to be out of the way.
Yeah.
What was the Grover Norquist quote? Government's so small you could drown it in a bathtub. Those days are gone. It is now about using the powers of the state to target your enemies, to clamp down on any and all opposition, to again create the kind of demographic base you would like to see. Deporting as many immigrants as possible and encouraging white Christian nativist birth rates. All in the hope of creating, again, this kind of nostalgic image of what your country once was. It may fall short of fascism, but that is certainly the direction it is going in.
And as we begin to wrap up here, you mentioned Project 2025 in your piece. How does this vision fit into Project 2025, which is basically this pre-vetting process for a future Trump officials if he were to win in November? That basically says it's a loyalty test, but also a test of are you a part of this kind of new far right ideology, basically.
This is what's so unsettling about the Orbán meeting with the Heritage Foundation, and beyond that, what the Heritage Foundation has become over the past few years. When Trump was first elected back in 2016 and then entered office 2017, he did not have the kind of, again, to use the term I just undercut a moment ago, intellectual architecture to bring with him to staff out the administration to implement many of the policies he talked about on the stump. There were plenty of disappointments in terms of the Trump administration itself, in terms of what Trump promised on the campaign trail. That, again, is all gone almost entirely thanks to the Heritage Foundation building out the kind of immediate policy recommendations that can be implemented on day one or within the first month or within the first 100 days. Again, whether that's deporting migrants, whether that's clamping down on opposition, whether that's using things like the Insurrection Act to target protesters who may emerge after a Trump reentry into the White House. It is across the board immediate targeting of the kind of rights that Americans have enjoyed for decades, for certain parts of the U.S. for centuries at this point, from day one. It is about identifying personnel. It is about identifying policies, and it's about identifying opportunities that Trump can immediately use to his advantage, to his base's advantage, as he takes the United States of America on this march toward authoritarianism. It's called Project 2025, and this partnership with Orbán is, frankly, it's just building out what they've already talked about. And at this point, when Trump gets into office, if he wins in November, it'll be just the beginning.
Last question, because I meant to hit on this earlier. How does the Islamophobia of Orbán play into this? Because, I'm just trying to, there are a lot of strongmen in this world right now that are explicitly anti-Muslim. And I think also of Modi in India as another example. Netanyahu, it's quite clear.
Sure, yeah.
But Trump as well. Some of the conspiracy theories he spread about Muslims celebrating on 9/11. Of course, everything with the travel ban. Being really rabidly anti-Muslim seems to be quite a through line as well.
Oh, absolutely it is. And, fortunately or otherwise, the United States of America, and certainly its leaders, especially in the Republican Party, they don't need to look to Orbán for encouragement of Islamophobic rhetoric. Obviously, this is something we have seen in the United States of America for at least the last 22, 23 years, if not longer. Again, I think it's worth reminding folks that Trump rose to political prominence through his birther conspiracies, his racist conspiracies about former President Obama, saying he may have been born elsewhere, and of course that he was potentially a secret Muslim as well. But I think, Emma, that's a great point that tethers so many of these strongmen, so many of these nativists together, whether it's Modi in India, whether it's Orbán in Hungary, whether it's folks like Marine Le Pen in France, and other potential vectors for future authoritarian influence and positions of power in the West. I unfortunately suspect this is going to be with us for a very long time. But again, we have this mutual reinforcement between Trump and Orbán that they would love to see how far they can take it.
Well, Casey Michel, director of the Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation. The book Foreign Agents, How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World is coming out soon. When is it coming out, Casey? We should have you back.
Thanks so much, Emma. I would love to be back. It comes out in August 27th. We'll have plenty more on how authoritarian regimes are using Americans, sometimes perfectly willing Americans, to do their dirty work right here in the United States.
All right. Well, we'll put a note, and in the summer, we'll reach back out. Thanks so much, Casey. We'll put a link to your piece in the New Republic in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm.
Great. Thanks, Emma.